On a fog-shrouded night in Charleston, South Carolina, two women gave birth within hours of each other in the grand Pemberton mansion. One a French countess, the other her personal slave. By dawn, both infants had vanished from their cribs, replaced by children who would grow up to inherit fortunes they had no right to claim. What followed was a carefully orchestrated deception spanning 34 years, involving forged documents, strategic murders, and a conspiracy so intricate that when it finally unraveled in 1865, it destroyed not just one of America's wealthiest families, but exposed a network of similar schemes throughout the antebellum South. The truth about that night would remain buried in courthouse records and private letters until a mysterious fire in 1923 consumed the evidence forever. Before we continue with the story of Countess Margot de Villefort and her deadly pact, we need to hear from our community of mystery lovers. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow dark history enthusiasts across America, and your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. What makes this tale particularly chilling is how a single night's desperate decision would ripple through decades, touching the lives of politicians, judges, and society's elite in ways they never imagined. Charleston in 1831 stood as the jewel of Southern society, its cobblestone streets lined with magnificent mansions that housed America's cotton aristocracy. The Pemberton estate occupied an entire city block on East Bay Street, its three-story Georgian facade overlooking the harbor where merchant ships arrived daily, their hulls heavy with European luxuries destined for the drawing rooms of the wealthy. Spanish moss draped the live oaks that shaded the property, creating an atmosphere of old-world elegance that perfectly suited its inhabitants. The master of this domain was Colonel Harrison Pemberton, a third-generation plantation owner whose family had built their fortune on rice and cotton. At 52, he commanded respect in Charleston's social circles, serving on the city council and hosting lavish dinner parties for visiting dignitaries. His weathered hands bore the calluses of a man who still rode his lands daily, inspecting the fields that stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Carolina low country. But it was his young French wife who truly captivated Charleston society. Countess Margot de Villefort had arrived in America 3 years earlier, fleeing the political upheavals that followed France's July Revolution. At 28, she possessed the refined beauty that European aristocracy seemed to breed naturally. Porcelain skin, amber eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and an elegant bearing that made other plantation wives feel provincial by comparison. She spoke 4 languages fluently and played piano with such skill that even the most accomplished Charleston matrons fell silent when her fingers touched the keys. The Countess had brought with her not only trunks of Parisian gowns and family jewels, but also Celeste, a young mulatto woman who served as her personal attendant. Celeste was unusual among the household slaves. She could read and write in both French and English, skills the Countess had taught her during long Atlantic crossings. At 25, Celeste possessed a sharp intelligence that she carefully concealed behind a mask of subservient silence. Her light complexion and refined features often led visitors to mistake her for a free woman of color, an error the Countess never bothered to correct. The household dynamics grew more complex as months passed. Colonel Pemberton, despite his public devotion to his beautiful wife, had developed what the other planters delicately termed plantation habits. His nocturnal visits to the slave quarters were whispered about in Charleston drawing rooms, though never discussed openly. The unwritten rules of Southern society demanded such indiscretions remain private, even when they produced the inevitable mixed-race children who worked alongside their darker-skinned half-siblings. Celeste had caught the colonel's attention almost immediately upon her arrival. Her education and beauty set her apart from the other house slaves, and Pemberton began summoning her to his study in the evenings, ostensibly to help with correspondence that required French translation. These sessions gradually extended later into the night, and by autumn of 1830, the household slaves whispered knowingly about the colonel's new fascination. Meanwhile, The Countess had formed an unlikely friendship with Dr. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a fellow French exile who had established a medical practice among Charleston's elite. Rousseau was a striking man in his early 30s, with the intense dark eyes and passionate temperament common among revolutionary intellectuals. He had fled France after publishing pamphlets advocating for the abolition of slavery, views that he wisely kept to himself in Charleston while building his practice treating the city's wealthy families. The doctor's visits to the Pemberton mansion became increasingly frequent throughout 1830, officially to treat the Countess for what he diplomatically termed nervous conditions, common among European ladies adjusting to southern climate. Their consultations often lasted hours, conducted in rapid French that the household staff could not understand. The Countess would emerge from these sessions with flushed cheeks and bright eyes, her melancholy temporarily lifted. By winter of 1830, both women were showing the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. The Countess announced her condition with great joy, attributing it to the beneficial effects of Carolina air and her husband's devotion. Colonel Pemberton publicly expressed his delight at the prospect of an heir, though privately he seemed more preoccupied with business matters and spent increasing time away from the mansion on plantation affairs. Celeste's pregnancy was handled more discreetly. Such situations were common enough in plantation households that they rarely caused comment, and the Countess matter-of-factly informed her husband that her personal attendant would be unable to perform heavy duties for several months. She arranged for Celeste to move to a small cottage on the mansion grounds, ostensibly to ensure better care during her confinement. As spring arrived, both pregnancies progressed normally, though the Countess began displaying a nervousness that even her husband noticed. She started taking long walks alone in the garden, often stopping to speak in hushed tones with Celeste when she encountered her near the cottage. The household staff, trained to notice every nuance of their master's moods, sensed an underlying tension that seemed to grow stronger as the expected birth dates approached. The truth behind this tension would not emerge for another 34 years, but its roots lay in two secrets that would prove equally dangerous. The Countess's child was not her husband's, and Celeste's pregnancy had resulted from the Colonel's nocturnal visits. Both women understood the devastating consequences if these facts became known. The Countess would be cast out of society in disgrace, while Celeste would likely be sold away from her child, a fate she had witnessed befall other slave women who had attracted their master's unwanted attention. The storm that struck Charleston on the night of March 15th, 1831, seemed to mirror the turbulent emotions brewing within the Pemberton mansion. Rain lashed against the tall windows, while wind howled through the live oaks, their massive branches groaning under the assault. Lightning illuminated the harbor in stark flashes, revealing merchant ships straining at their anchor chains as waves crashed against the seawall. Inside the mansion, the Countess paced restlessly through the candlelit rooms, one hand pressed against her swollen belly as contractions began their relentless rhythm. Her labor had started at sunset, just as the first clouds gathered on the horizon. Celeste, whose own birth pains had commenced only hours earlier, remained in her cottage, attended by Mama Ruth, the elderly slave woman who served as midwife for the plantation. Dr. Rousseau arrived near midnight, his medical bag clutched tightly as he hurried through the pelting rain. His usual composed demeanor showed cracks of anxiety as he was escorted to the Countess's chambers, where she gripped the bedpost with white knuckles, her carefully arranged hair now damp with perspiration. Colonel Pemberton waited downstairs in his study, maintaining the traditional distance Southern gentlemen kept from the messy business of childbirth. "The storm grows worse," the Countess gasped between contractions, her amber eyes fixed on the lightning that intermittently blazed through the room. "Perhaps it is an omen." Dr. Rousseau knelt beside her bed, checking her pulse with practiced efficiency. "Storms often accompany births," he replied in French, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Nature seems to understand the significance of such moments." As the hours dragged toward dawn, both women labored in parallel struggles separated by less than 50 yards. The Countess's cries, muffled by silk pillows and thick mansion walls, competed with the storm's fury. In the cottage, Celeste bit down on a strip of leather to silence her own sounds of pain, knowing that any disturbance might draw unwanted attention from the main house. Mama Ruth moved between her two patients with the efficiency born of delivering countless plantation babies. At 73, she had seen every variety of birth complication and family secret. Her gnarled hands possessed an almost supernatural ability to guide new life into the world, and her discretion had earned her the trust of 3 generations of Charleston's elite. What she witnessed that night would test even her legendary ability to keep silent. The Countess's child arrived first, just as the storm began to subside around 4 in the morning. Dr. Rousseau held the infant with hands that shook slightly as he examined the tiny features by candlelight. The baby's olive skin and dark hair left no doubt about paternity. This was clearly his daughter, not Colonel Pemberton's heir. "She is beautiful," he whispered in French, but his voice carried the weight of understanding the catastrophe this birth represented. If the Colonel saw this child, questions would arise that could destroy all their lives. Less than an hour later, Mama Ruth helped deliver Celeste's baby in the cottage, a boy with fair skin and the distinctive Pemberton nose that had marked 3 generations of the family. The irony was not lost on the old midwife who had attended the Colonel's birth 32 years earlier and recognized the family resemblance immediately. As dawn broke over Charleston, painting the storm-washed streets in pale gold, 2 women faced the reality of their impossible situations. The Countess stared at her daughter, knowing that presenting this obviously mixed-race child as her husband's heir would expose her adultery immediately. Celeste held her son, understanding that while his light skin might protect him from field work, he would still grow up enslaved, forever barred from claiming his true heritage as a Pemberton. It was Dr. Rousseau who first voiced what they were all thinking. After ensuring that Colonel Pemberton remained occupied with storm damage assessments around the property, he slipped back to the Countess's chamber, where she sat holding her daughter with desperate tenderness. "We must consider the practical realities," he said quietly, his medical training helping him approach the crisis with clinical detachment. "Your husband expects to see his son and heir. If he sees this child—" The Countess's amber eyes filled with tears, but her aristocratic breeding had taught her to face disasters with dignity. "I know what you are suggesting, Jean-Baptiste. But how could such a thing be possible?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Mama Ruth appeared in the doorway, her ancient face creased with concern. "Miss Margot," she said carefully, using the familiar address she had earned through years of faithful service, "there might be a way to protect both these babies." The old woman's words hung in the air like smoke from the dying candles. She had delivered both children within hours of each other, and she alone understood the full scope of the dilemma. More importantly, she possessed the practical knowledge of how plantation secrets were kept and family lines protected. "Celeste's boy could pass for your child," Mama Ruth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And your little girl, she could grow up as Celeste's daughter. Both children would live. Both would be protected in different ways." The Countess felt her world shifting beneath her like sand during the recent storm. The proposal was monstrous in its deception, yet it offered the only path forward that might preserve everyone's safety. Her daughter would grow up enslaved but protected, while Celeste's son would inherit a fortune that was rightfully his by blood, if not by law. Dr. Rousseau understood immediately the medical complications such a deception would require. "The birth records," he said slowly, "they would need to be altered. And your husband, he must never suspect." Celeste, who had been summoned from the cottage once the Colonel departed for a planned inspection of his rice fields, listened to the proposed exchange with the stoic acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect justice from life. Her son would gain everything: education, wealth, freedom, while her mistress's daughter would face the harsh realities of slavery. The bitter irony was not lost on any of them. "What guarantee do I have?" Celeste asked quietly, her intelligence cutting through to the heart of the matter. "What prevents you from simply taking my child and discarding me once this deception is in place?" The Countess met her eyes with surprising directness. "Because we will both be equally trapped by this secret. Your silence protects my daughter's life, while my protection ensures your son's future. Neither of us can betray the other without destroying what we most want to save." As the morning sun climbed higher over Charleston, illuminating a city washed clean by the storm, 3 adults made a pact that would reshape 2 families forever. Dr. Rousseau would alter the birth records, listing himself as attending physician for both births, but recording only 1 child born to the Countess, a healthy son. Celeste would publicly claim the mixed-race daughter as her own, while privately helping to raise the boy who was actually hers. The physical exchange took place before Colonel Pemberton returned from his property inspections. Mama Ruth carefully swaddled both infants, her experienced hands ensuring that the switch would appear natural to anyone who had not witnessed the actual births. The Countess held her son, Celeste's son, and marveled at how perfectly he fit the role of Pemberton heir. But as she watched Celeste cradle the mixed-race infant who was actually her daughter, the Countess felt the first stirrings of the obsessive protectiveness that would drive her actions for the next 3 decades. This was not simply a matter of switching children. It was the beginning of an elaborate performance that would require constant vigilance to maintain. The deception held remarkably well through the first years following that stormy March night. Colonel Pemberton welcomed his supposed heir with genuine pride, naming the boy Charles Harrison Pemberton after his own grandfather. The child grew into a handsome toddler with the fair complexion and strong features that marked him unmistakably as plantation aristocracy. Visitors to the mansion cooed over young Charles, commenting on his remarkable resemblance to his father and predicting a brilliant future for the Pemberton dynasty. Meanwhile, the Countess lavished attention on Celeste's daughter, who had been named Marie and was officially recorded as the child of a house slave. The Countess insisted that Marie receive education alongside Charles, justifying this unusual arrangement by claiming she needed a companion for her son, and that Marie showed exceptional intelligence. Skeptical relatives and neighbors accepted this explanation, though they privately wondered at the Countess's peculiar attachment to a slave child. Dr. Rousseau became a frequent visitor to the mansion, ostensibly serving as the family physician, but actually helping to maintain the careful balance their secret required. He monitored both children's health with unusual attention to detail, ensuring that any family resemblances that might emerge would be properly managed or explained away. The first real challenge to their deception came when Charles turned 5 years old. The boy began displaying intellectual capabilities that far exceeded what anyone expected, even accounting for his privileged upbringing. He learned to read with remarkable speed, showed an intuitive understanding of mathematics, and possessed a musical aptitude that rivaled his supposed mother's talents. More troubling, he began asking pointed questions about his appearance compared to other plantation children. "Why do I look different from cousin Edmund?" Charles asked the Countess one afternoon in 1836, referring to another planter's son during a social gathering. "His hair is darker, and his skin does not tan like mine does." The Countess felt her carefully constructed world tremble. "Children grow differently," she replied carefully. "You take after your father's family, while Edmund resembles his mother's people." But Charles was too intelligent to accept simple explanations. His questions became more persistent, and worse, he began forming an unusually close bond with Marie, who worked as his personal attendant despite being only 5 herself. The 2 children seemed to share an almost supernatural understanding of each other's thoughts, finishing each other's sentences and displaying the kind of intuitive connection that worried all 3 conspirators. Celeste, who had been granted the unusual privilege of remaining in the mansion as head of the household staff, watched her biological son with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She could not acknowledge their relationship, but she found subtle ways to guide his education and protect him from the harsher realities of plantation life. Her interactions with Marie, the Countess's actual daughter, were more complicated. She loved the child but struggled with the knowledge that every advantage Charles gained came at Marie's expense. The Countess, meanwhile, developed an almost obsessive need to control every aspect of both children's development. She supervised their lessons personally, chose their playmates carefully, and monitored their conversations for any signs that their true parentage might emerge naturally. This hypervigilance began to affect her health and social relationships, though she disguised her anxiety as natural maternal protectiveness. Dr. Rousseau recognized the psychological strain the deception was placing on everyone involved. During his regular visits, he observed how the Countess's hands trembled when she watched Charles play, how Celeste's eyes followed her biological son with barely concealed longing, and how both children seemed somehow aware that their lives were built on foundations they did not understand. The situation grew more complex as Charleston society began to take notice of the unusual household arrangements. While wealthy planters often indulged favorite slaves with special privileges, the Countess's treatment of Marie raised eyebrows among the more traditional families. She insisted that Marie attend the same tutoring sessions as Charles, wear clothing that was far too fine for a slave child, and participate in family meals when no visitors were present. "That French woman spoils her house slaves beyond all reason," whispered Mrs. Cornelius Whitlock during a ladies' tea in 1837. "Mark my words, such permissiveness leads to nothing but trouble. Slaves who forget their place become dangerous." These murmurs reached Colonel Pemberton's ears, causing him to question his wife's management of the household for the first time since their marriage. The confrontation that followed nearly shattered their carefully maintained facade. "Margot, I've been hearing disturbing reports about your treatment of the slaves," the colonel said one evening as they sat in his study, "particularly concerning that mulatto girl you've taken such a liking to." The Countess felt ice form in her veins, but her aristocratic training served her well. "Marie is exceptionally bright," she replied smoothly. "I thought it would benefit Charles to have an educated companion, someone who could assist with his studies and provide appropriate company when other children are not available. Educated slaves become rebellious slaves," Pemberton countered firmly. "And there's talk among our neighbors about your unusual attachments. It reflects poorly on our family's reputation." The threat in his words was unmistakable. The Countess understood that she was walking a dangerous line between protecting her daughter and maintaining the deception about her son. Any behavior that seemed too far outside plantation norms could invite closer scrutiny, which might uncover the truth about both children's parentage. That night, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She called Celeste to her private chambers and delivered devastating news. "Marie must be sold," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "My husband suspects something, and if we draw more attention to her presence here, everything could unravel." Celeste stared at her mistress in shock. This was the one outcome they had not anticipated when making their pact 6 years earlier. "You promised she would be protected," she whispered. "And she will be," the Countess replied desperately. "I will arrange for her sale to a family in Savannah. People I know will treat her well. She'll be educated, well cared for, and safe from discovery." The bitter irony was overwhelming. To protect the deception that gave Charles his inheritance, the Countess had to sacrifice her own daughter to slavery in a distant city. Celeste recognized the terrible logic, even as her heart broke for the child she had raised as her own for 6 years. But Marie's departure created an unexpected problem. Charles, now 6 years old, reacted to losing his closest companion with inconsolable grief. He refused to eat, barely spoke, and seemed to lose all interest in his studies and play. Worse, he began asking increasingly pointed questions about where Marie had gone and why she could not return. "She was my sister," he declared, with the absolute certainty of childhood, a statement that sent chills through everyone who heard it. "Not my slave, my sister, and sister should not be sold away." Dr. Rousseau suggested that Charles's reaction indicated an emotional instability that might require treatment. But the Countess recognized it as something far more dangerous. The intuitive understanding between the two children had created a bond that transcended their supposed relationship. Charles somehow sensed that Marie was more important to his identity than anyone was willing to admit. The sale was arranged through intermediaries to avoid creating a paper trail that might later implicate the Countess in suspicious favoritism. Marie was sold to the Carrington family in Savannah, who were told she was a bright house slave who had been overly indulged by her previous owners. The Countess provided a substantial financial incentive to ensure Marie would receive education and kind treatment, though she could never acknowledge the real reason for her generosity. On the day Marie left Charleston, hidden in the back of a merchant's wagon, both women stood at different windows of the mansion and watched their daughter disappear down the tree-lined avenue. Neither could show their grief openly, but Celeste noticed how the Countess's hands gripped the window frame until her knuckles turned white, and the Countess observed how Celeste's shoulders shook with barely contained sobs. Charles ran after the wagon for nearly a quarter-mile before the coachman caught him and carried him back to the mansion. His screams of, "Bring back my sister," echoed through the neighborhood, causing other plantation families to exchange meaningful glances about the Pemberton household's peculiar dynamics. The years following Marie's departure marked a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the Pemberton household. Charles, now 7 years old, seemed to retreat into himself, displaying a melancholy that no amount of privilege could cure. His extraordinary intellectual gifts continued to develop. He mastered Latin by age 8 and showed remarkable aptitude for legal reasoning, but his emotional state remained fragile. More disturbing, he began to demonstrate an almost uncanny ability to uncover secrets and lies, as if losing Marie had awakened a suspicious intelligence that questioned everything around him. The Countess threw herself into managing Charles's education with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She hired the finest tutors Charleston could provide, supervised his lessons personally, and began grooming him for a future that would establish the Pemberton name among America's most influential families. But her hyper-attentiveness had an unexpected consequence. Charles began to study her with the same analytical intensity she applied to him. "Mother," he said one morning in 1838, using the formal address she had taught him, "why do you watch me so carefully when you think I am not looking?" The question, delivered with the directness of childhood, struck the Countess like a physical blow. "All mothers watch their children," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But not like you do," Charles persisted with uncomfortable accuracy. "You watch me like you are afraid I might disappear. And sometimes when you think no one sees, you look sad when you look at me. Why would I make you sad?" These conversations became more frequent and probing as Charles matured. His intelligence was developing into something formidable, and the Countess began to realize that the very gifts that would ensure his success might also lead him to uncover the truth about his origins. Meanwhile, Celeste had been promoted to head housekeeper, a position that gave her unprecedented access to the family's private affairs. She used this advantage to gather information about Charles's development and, more secretly, to track news of Marie's life in Savannah. Through a network of slave communications that connected plantations across the South, she learned that Marie was indeed being well treated, but was showing signs of the same intellectual precociousness that marked Charles. Dr. Rousseau continued his regular visits, but his role had evolved from medical care to psychological counseling for all three conspirators. The strain of maintaining their deception was taking a visible toll. The Countess suffered from persistent headaches and episodes of nervous exhaustion, while Celeste displayed the controlled tension of someone constantly anticipating disaster. "This cannot continue indefinitely," Rousseau warned during a private consultation with the Countess in 1839. "Charles is too intelligent, too observant. Eventually he will begin to piece together inconsistencies in his family history." The doctor's concerns proved prophetic sooner than anyone anticipated. In the summer of 1840, when Charles was 9 years old, he made a discovery that threatened to unravel everything they had built. While exploring the mansion's library, Charles found a collection of his mother's personal papers that had been carelessly left unlocked. Among them was a letter Dr. Rousseau had written to the Countess shortly after the children's births, discussing the delicate nature of the arrangement and the need for continued vigilance regarding the exchange. Charles could not fully understand the letter's implications, but his precocious intelligence grasped that it referred to some kind of significant deception involving his birth. More importantly, the letter mentioned Marie by name, describing her as the other child involved in our agreement. That evening at dinner, Charles looked directly at his supposed parents and asked, "What exchange were you and Dr. Rousseau discussing in your letter about Marie and me?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. Colonel Pemberton, who knew nothing of the letter or its contents, looked confused. The Countess felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Only Celeste, serving at table, understood the full catastrophe of the moment. "I don't know what you mean, darling," the Countess managed to say, her training in aristocratic composure barely holding her voice steady. But Charles had inherited more than intelligence from his biological parents. He had also acquired their ability to detect deception. "You do know," he said quietly, "and someday I'm going to find out what really happened the night I was born." The threat in those words, spoken by a 9-year-old child, chilled everyone present. Charles had just declared war against the lies that had shaped his entire existence, and they all understood that his formidable intelligence made him a dangerous opponent. Colonel Pemberton's confusion about the exchange led him to question his wife privately later that evening. The Countess managed to deflect his inquiries by claiming that Charles had misunderstood an old letter about purchasing household goods, but she could see doubt beginning to form in her husband's eyes. The situation grew more perilous when Charles began conducting what could only be described as investigations into his family history. He questioned the household slaves about the night of his birth, studied family portraits for resemblances, and even attempted to correspond with relatives in France to learn more about his mother's background. Celeste found herself in an impossible position. Charles's questions often came to her, since her role as head housekeeper gave her authority over household records and slave testimony. She had to balance protecting the deception with avoiding outright lies to the boy who was actually her son. "Miss Celeste," Charles said one afternoon in 1841, using the respectful address he had been taught for favored house slaves, "do you remember anything unusual about the night I was born?" Celeste felt her heart racing, but she had learned to school her expressions over years of slavery. "Was a terrible storm that night," she said carefully. "Worst I ever seen. Trees falling, rain coming down like Judgment Day." "But do you remember anything about Marie being born too, around the same time?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Celeste understood that her next words might determine the fate of both children she had brought into the world. "Lots of babies born during storms," she replied finally. "Storms seem to bring babies into the world, but I was just helping Mama Ruth. Wasn't my place to pay attention to such things." Charles studied her face with those penetrating eyes that reminded her so painfully of herself. "You liked Marie very much, didn't you? More than most slaves like other slaves' children." "Marie was a sweet child," Celeste admitted, allowing genuine emotion to color her voice. "Any person would have loved that little girl." "I still dream about her sometimes," Charles said quietly. "I dream that she was not really your daughter at all, that she was something else, someone else." The conversation ended there, but Celeste understood that Charles's subconscious mind was working toward truths his conscious intellect had not yet grasped. The boy was literally dreaming his way toward discovering their deception, and there seemed to be no way to stop him. That same year brought external pressures that complicated their situation further. Colonel Pemberton's health began to decline, raising questions about inheritance and succession that the Countess had hoped to defer for many more years. Charleston society expected Charles to begin taking on responsibilities befitting a future plantation owner, which meant increased scrutiny of his character, capabilities, and family connections. The Countess realized that time was running out for maintaining their secret. Charles would soon be old enough to demand real answers to his questions. Colonel Pemberton's eventual death would require legal documentation that might expose inconsistencies, and the pressure of their deception was beginning to affect everyone's mental stability. But the greatest threat came from an unexpected source. In late 1841, word reached Charleston that Marie, now 10 years old, had been displaying extraordinary intellectual abilities in Savannah. The Carrington family had been so impressed with her capabilities that they were considering sending her north for advanced education, an almost unheard-of opportunity for a slave child. If Marie received such education, she would eventually possess the knowledge and social connections to investigate her own origins. Two brilliant children, separated by geography but connected by blood and mystery, were both moving toward discoveries that could destroy the elaborate deception that had shaped their lives. The Countess understood that she faced a choice that would define the rest of her existence. She could continue protecting the secret that preserved her family's reputation and Charles's inheritance, or she could find a way to reveal the truth before it exploded beyond her control. But protection of the secret would require measures far more drastic than anything she had previously contemplated. By 1842, the careful balance that had maintained the Pemberton family's deception for 11 years began showing dangerous cracks. Charles, now 11 years old, had grown into a formidable young man whose intellectual gifts were matched by an increasingly ruthless determination to uncover the truth about his origins. His questions had evolved from childish curiosity into systematic investigations that demonstrated a natural aptitude for legal reasoning and evidence gathering. The breaking point came when Charles discovered that Dr. Rousseau had been maintaining two separate medical journals, one official record for his practice, and another private journal that contained detailed notes about his patients' most sensitive secrets. Charles had observed the doctor's habit of writing in this private journal during visits to the mansion, and had deduced its location in the doctor's study. One autumn afternoon, while accompanying his supposed mother on a social call to discuss Charles's future education, the boy slipped away from the adults and systematically searched Dr. Rousseau's study. What he found exceeded his worst suspicions about his family's secrets. The private journal contained explicit references to the exchange of infants, detailed medical observations about both children's development, and most damning of all, records of substantial payments from the Countess to maintain discretion regarding the arrangement. The entries painted a clear picture of a conspiracy involving switched children, forged records, and ongoing deception that had lasted over a decade. But Charles found something else that chilled him even more than confirmation of his suspicions. Recent entries indicating that Dr. Rousseau was growing increasingly unstable under the pressure of maintaining the secret. The doctor had begun drinking heavily, and his journal entries showed signs of paranoia and guilt that suggested he might be approaching a complete psychological breakdown. "The boy suspects everything," read one entry from August 1842. "His questions grow more pointed each month, and I fear he has inherited intelligence that will eventually expose us all." The Countess grows desperate, speaking of measures that frighten even me. How long can we continue this charade before it destroys us all? More disturbing were the doctor's references to communications he had been receiving from Savannah about Marie's development. The Carrington family had written to him asking about the girl's medical history, having noticed unusual physical characteristics that did not match her supposed parentage. Marie was developing features that strongly resembled European aristocracy, rather than the African ancestry expected in a slave child. Charles carefully copied key passages from the journal before returning it to its hiding place. As he rejoined the adults, his mind was already formulating plans for how to use this information. The boy had just acquired weapons that could destroy everyone who had deceived him, but he was also beginning to understand the complex motivations behind their actions. That evening, Charles confronted the Countess in her private chambers with a directness that left her speechless. "I know about the exchange," he said simply, producing the copied journal entries. "I know that Marie was your real daughter, and that I am the son of a slave." What I do not understand is why you have maintained this deception for so long. The Countess stared at the papers in his hands, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. But her aristocratic breeding served her even in this moment of crisis. "If you truly understand what those papers contain," she replied quietly, "then you also understand what revealing this information would mean for both of us." Charles considered this with the calculating intelligence that had made him such a formidable opponent. "You would be disgraced and probably cast out of society," he said slowly. "I would lose everything. Inheritance, education, social position, freedom itself. We are both trapped by this secret." "Precisely," the Countess confirmed, "which is why it must never be revealed." But Charles had already moved beyond simple exposure to more complex calculations about power and leverage. "There is another person trapped by this secret," he pointed out. "My real mother, the slave woman who has watched me grow up without being able to acknowledge our relationship." The Countess felt ice form in her veins. Charles's questions had evolved into demands, and his demands suggested he was planning actions that could be far more dangerous than simple revelation. "Celeste has been well cared for," the Countess said defensively. "She holds a position of authority in this household that few slaves ever achieve." "But she is still a slave," Charles replied with uncomfortable precision. "And I am living the life that should have belonged to Marie. These facts create certain moral obligations." The implied threat in his words was unmistakable. Charles was not simply demanding acknowledgement of the truth. He was positioning himself to remake the entire arrangement according to his own moral calculations. Over the following weeks, Charles began implementing a campaign that demonstrated strategic thinking far beyond his 11 years. He started by approaching Celeste directly, speaking to her in private moments when the Countess could not intervene. "I know you are my mother," he told her one morning as she supervised the cleaning of his room. "And I know that somewhere in Savannah my sister Marie is living as a slave while I enjoy privileges that rightfully belong to her." Celeste had prepared for this moment for years, but hearing the words spoken aloud still shocked her into silence. She stared at the boy who carried her blood, but could never publicly claim her name, understanding that everything was about to change. "What you know, and what you can prove, are different things," she finally replied, using the careful language of someone who had survived slavery by choosing words precisely. "I can prove everything," Charles said quietly. "Dr. Rousseau's journals contain detailed records of the entire deception. But I am not interested in destruction. I am interested in justice." His proposal was both brilliant and terrifying in its implications. Charles wanted to gradually transfer significant portions of his inheritance to both Celeste and Marie, creating a complex legal arrangement that would provide for his biological family without publicly acknowledging the relationship. He had already begun studying inheritance law and had identified several mechanisms that could accomplish this goal. But his plan required the active cooperation of all three conspirators, and Charles made it clear that he was prepared to expose everything if they refused to participate. The boy had effectively taken control of the situation through intellectual superiority and moral leverage. The Countess found herself facing an opponent who possessed all of her own strategic capabilities, plus the ruthless clarity of youth. Charles was offering her a choice between gradual financial loss and complete social destruction, and they both understood which option she would be forced to choose. Dr. Rousseau's reaction to Charles's demands provided the first indication of how dangerous their situation had become. When the Countess informed him of the boy's discovery and demands, the doctor's already fragile psychological state completely collapsed. "He wants to destroy us all," Rousseau ranted during a midnight visit to the mansion, his breath reeking of alcohol and his hands shaking with nervous exhaustion. "That child has become a demon sent to punish us for our sins." The Countess tried to calm him, but Rousseau's paranoia had progressed beyond rational discussion. He began making wild accusations about Charles's intentions, claiming the boy was planning to have them all arrested for fraud and conspiracy. More dangerously, he started threatening to resolve the situation by eliminating Charles before the boy could expose their secrets. "One accident," Rousseau muttered. "A riding mishap. Perhaps a fall from the mansion roof while playing. Children die in such ways all the time, and no one questions tragic accidents." The Countess recoiled from the suggestion, but she could not dismiss the doctor's desperation. Rousseau held detailed knowledge of their deception, and his deteriorating mental state made him capable of actions that could destroy them all, whether through violence or confession. Charles, meanwhile, had begun corresponding secretly with contacts in Savannah, attempting to gather information about Marie's current situation. His letters, written under assumed names and sent through intermediaries, revealed that Marie was indeed displaying the intellectual and physical characteristics that marked her as aristocratic rather than slave-born. The Carrington family had noticed these anomalies and had written to Charleston asking questions about Marie's parentage and medical history. Their inquiries had reached Dr. Rousseau, who had deflected them with vague responses about mixed ancestry and unusual inheritance patterns. But the questions were becoming more persistent, and the Carringtons were beginning to suspect that Marie's origins might be more complex than they had been told. The situation reached a crisis point in December 1842, when Dr. Rousseau attempted to implement his plan to eliminate Charles. The boy had developed a habit of taking evening walks in the mansion gardens, using the solitude to think through his increasingly complex schemes for redistributing his inheritance. Rousseau waited in the garden shadows with a loaded pistol, planning to make Charles's death appear to be the result of a robbery attempt by escaped slaves. But Charles' intellectual gifts included an almost supernatural awareness of threats and deception. He sensed the doctor's presence before Rousseau could position himself for a clear shot. The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of how thoroughly their original deception had corrupted everyone involved. Charles faced down the doctor with the calm assurance of someone who had anticipated this possibility and prepared for it. "Dr. Rousseau," he said quietly, not bothering to show fear of the weapon pointed at his chest, "I expected you would eventually reach this conclusion. Your journal entries have been growing increasingly desperate, and desperation leads to poor decisions." Rousseau's hands shook as he aimed the pistol. "You should have left well enough alone, boy. Some secrets are too dangerous to uncover." "But killing me will not preserve your secret," Charles pointed out with devastating logic. "I have already documented everything I discovered, and those documents are hidden where they will be found. If anything happens to me, my death would guarantee exposure of everything you hoped to protect." The bluff worked because it sounded entirely plausible coming from Charles. Rousseau lowered the weapon, understanding that he had been outmaneuvered by an 11-year-old child who thought 3 moves ahead of every adult around him. But Charles was not finished demonstrating his control of the situation. "You have become a liability to everyone involved in our arrangement," he continued. "Your drinking, your paranoia, your violent impulses, all of these things threaten to expose secrets that others still want to protect. Perhaps it is time for you to consider relocating your practice to a different city." The suggestion carried the force of a command, backed by devastating consequences. Charles was effectively banishing Dr. Rousseau from Charleston, using the same leverage that had given him control over the Countess and Celeste. Rousseau understood that his position had become untenable. Within a week, he had sold his practice and departed Charleston for parts unknown, leaving behind only a brief note claiming that family obligations required his immediate relocation. His departure eliminated the most unstable element of their conspiracy, but also removed the medical expertise that had helped maintain their deception. Charles watched the doctor's departure with satisfaction, but he understood that removing Rousseau was only the first step in his larger plan. The boy had successfully taken control of the situation, but control brought responsibilities that would test his resolve and moral calculations in ways he had not yet fully anticipated. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The winter of 1843 brought Charles face to face with the true complexity of the justice he claimed to seek, as events in both Charleston and Savannah began moving toward a convergence that would force him to choose between revenge and redemption. The spring of 1843 brought news that would force all the conspirators to confront the ultimate consequences of their 11-year deception. Marie, now 12 years old, and living under the name Maria Carrington in Savannah, had attracted the attention of Northern abolitionists who were documenting cases of obviously mixed-race children being held in slavery despite their European features. A delegation from the American Anti-Slavery Society had visited Savannah and encountered Marie during their investigation of illegal slave trading practices. Her refined speech, classical education, and unmistakably aristocratic bearing had convinced them that she was likely the victim of kidnapping or fraudulent enslavement. They were preparing to file legal challenges that would require extensive documentation of her origins and parentage. Charles received this information through his secret correspondence network and understood immediately that their carefully maintained deception was about to face scrutiny from lawyers and investigators who possessed resources far beyond anything they had previously encountered. The abolitionists would demand birth records, medical documentation, and testimony from everyone who had been present during Marie's supposed birth. But Charles had evolved far beyond the frightened child who had first discovered their secret. Now 12 years old, he had spent months refining a plan that would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, exposing the truth about their switched identities, ensuring Marie's freedom, providing for Celeste's future, and destroying the Pemberton family's reputation in a way that satisfied his growing desire for revenge against the deception that had shaped his entire life. His opportunity came when Colonel Pemberton, whose health had been declining steadily, suffered a serious stroke in May 1843. The colonel's condition left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly, creating a power vacuum in the household that Charles was perfectly positioned to exploit. The Countess found herself managing both her husband's medical care and the increasingly complex legal questions surrounding their property and inheritance. Charleston's legal community expected young Charles to begin taking on responsibilities as the presumptive heir, which meant he would need to appear before judges and lawyers who would examine his credentials and family history with professional thoroughness. Charles used this situation to implement the most audacious phase of his plan. He approached Judge Samuel Thornbury, a family friend who was handling the preliminary legal work for the Pemberton estate, and requested a private meeting to discuss concerns about irregularities in my birth documentation. Judge Thornbury, who had known the Pemberton family for decades, initially dismissed Charles's concerns as the nervous anxiety of a young man facing adult responsibilities. But Charles presented his evidence with the systematic precision of a trained attorney, laying out documentation that painted an undeniable picture of fraud, conspiracy, and switched identities. "These are serious accusations, young man," Judge Thornbury said after reviewing Charles's materials. "If true, they would invalidate your inheritance claims and expose your family to criminal charges." "I understand the implications," Charles replied, with the calm assurance that had become his trademark. "But I believe justice requires that the truth be revealed, regardless of personal consequences." The judge studied the boy with new respect and growing concern. "What exactly are you asking me to do with this information?" Charles's answer revealed the full scope of his strategic thinking. He wanted Judge Thornbury to initiate a formal investigation into the switched identities, but to structure the investigation in a way that would maximize damage to the Pemberton reputation while providing legal protection for Marie and Celeste. He had identified specific legal mechanisms that could accomplish these goals without exposing Marie to re-enslavement or Celeste to charges of conspiracy. "You are asking me to help you destroy your own family," Judge Thornbury observed. I am asking you to help me correct an injustice that has lasted 12 years, Charles corrected. My biological mother deserves freedom, and my biological sister deserves her rightful inheritance. These outcomes matter more to me than preserving lies that benefit no one except those who created them. Judge Thornberry agreed to initiate a discreet investigation, but he insisted on first attempting to resolve the situation privately through negotiation with all parties involved. This decision gave the Countess one final opportunity to influence the outcome of Charles's campaign against their deception. The confrontation between the Countess and Charles took place in the mansion's library, surrounded by law books and family portraits that suddenly seemed to mock the lies they represented. Colonel Pemberton lay unconscious upstairs, unaware that his family's entire foundation was crumbling beneath him. "You have won," the Countess said quietly, her aristocratic composure finally cracking under months of pressure. "What happens now?" Charles considered the question with the thoroughness that had made him such a formidable opponent. "Marie returns to Charleston as my acknowledged sister and receives her share of the inheritance. Celeste receives her freedom and financial security. You must live with the consequences of your choices." "And you?" the Countess asked. "What happens to you when Charleston society learns that their presumptive heir is actually the son of a slave?" It was the question Charles had been avoiding throughout months of planning. His entire campaign for justice had focused on providing for others while ignoring the reality that revealing the truth would destroy his own future just as completely as it destroyed the Countess's reputation. "I will face whatever comes," he said simply. "But I will face it knowing that I chose truth over comfort, justice over privilege." The Countess studied the boy who had been both her salvation and her destruction. "You realize that Marie may not thank you for this revelation. She has spent 12 years believing herself to be a slave. Learning that she is actually aristocracy who was stolen from her birthright may not bring her the happiness you imagine." Charles had not considered this possibility, and the Countess's words planted seeds of doubt that would grow stronger as events progressed toward their inevitable conclusion. The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising speed. Judge Thornberry's investigation quickly confirmed the essential facts of Charles's accusations. Birth records had been altered, medical documentation contained suspicious inconsistencies, and testimony from surviving household staff supported the claim that an infant exchange had occurred in 1831. Marie was located in Savannah and brought back to Charleston under court protection. The reunion between the biological siblings was both emotional and complex, as 12 years of separated development had created two very different personalities shaped by radically different experiences. Marie had grown into a young woman whose intelligence matched Charles's own, but whose character had been formed by slavery's harsh realities. She possessed a wariness and survival instinct that Charles, despite his strategic brilliance, could never fully understand. When she learned the truth about their switched identities, her reaction was not gratitude, but fury at the adults who had manipulated their lives for over a decade. "You stole 12 years from both of us," she said to the Countess during their first meeting in the Charleston courthouse. 12 years of my birthright, 12 years of his true identity. No amount of legal resolution can return what you took." But Marie's anger extended beyond the Countess to include Charles himself. She viewed his revelation of their true parentage as another example of privilege manipulation, pointing out that he had chosen to expose their secret only when it served his own moral calculations, rather than consulting with her about what she might want. "Did you think to ask me whether I wanted to be rescued from my life?" she demanded during one of their supervised meetings. "Did you consider that I might have built relationships and goals that your justice would destroy?" Charles found himself facing questions he had not anticipated. His campaign for truth and justice had been planned without consulting the person he claimed to be helping, and Marie's reaction forced him to confront the possibility that his actions were motivated as much by revenge against the Countess as by concern for Marie's welfare. The legal resolution came in September 1843. When Judge Thornbury issued findings that officially recognized the switched identities and ordered appropriate remedies, Marie was legally freed and granted a portion of the Pemberton inheritance, while Celeste received her freedom and a financial settlement that would support her for life. But the social consequences extended far beyond legal documentation. The scandal destroyed the Pemberton family's reputation throughout Charleston and the broader South. Colonel Pemberton, still recovering from his stroke, was forced to witness the collapse of everything his family had built over 3 generations. The Countess faced social ostracism that made her life in Charleston impossible. She departed the city in October 1843, leaving behind only a brief letter explaining that she would spend her remaining years in a French convent, seeking redemption for sins that had destroyed innocent lives. Charles achieved the justice he had sought, but at a cost that exceeded his calculations. Charleston society, while fascinated by the scandal, could not accept a former slave as a legitimate heir to one of their most prominent families. Despite his legal victories, Charles found himself as much an outcast as the Countess he had defeated. The aftermath of the Pemberton scandal reverberated through Charleston society for decades, becoming the cautionary tale that wealthy families whispered about when discussing the dangers of keeping family secrets. But the true consequences of that March night in 1831 were far more complex and tragic than the simplified morality tales that emerged from the legal proceedings. Charles Pemberton, legally recognized as Charles Rousseau following the revelation of his true parentage, left Charleston in 1844 and moved north, where he used his portion of the inheritance to fund his education at Harvard Law School. He became a prominent attorney specializing in civil rights cases, particularly those involving questions of racial identity and inheritance law. His personal experience with the arbitrary nature of racial classification in American society drove him to challenge similar injustices throughout his career. But success could not heal the psychological wounds left by 12 years of living a lie. Charles never married, never established close friendships, and remained haunted by questions about identity and authenticity that his legal victories could not resolve. His private papers, discovered after his death in 1889, revealed a man who had spent his entire adult life questioning whether his pursuit of justice had been motivated by moral principle or personal revenge. Marie faced even more complex challenges in rebuilding her identity after the revelation. The legal proceedings had freed her from slavery and granted her financial security, but they could not erase 12 years of experiences that had shaped her fundamental understanding of the world. She struggled to adapt to the social expectations of aristocratic life, while maintaining connections to the slave community that had been her family for most of her childhood. She eventually married a free man of color from Philadelphia and used her inheritance to establish schools for freed slaves throughout the South. But those who knew her well observed that she never fully recovered from the trauma of learning that her entire childhood had been based on deception. The knowledge that she had been denied her birthright while her biological brother enjoyed privileges that should have been hers created a bitterness that affected all her relationships. Celeste, perhaps surprisingly, adapted most successfully to the changed circumstances. Her freedom and financial security allowed her to establish herself as a respected member of Charleston's free black community, and she used her literacy and organizational skills to help other former slaves navigate the complex legal and social challenges of emancipation. But even Celeste carried scars from the deception. In interviews conducted years later by historians studying the antebellum period, she spoke about the psychological toll of watching her biological son grow up without being able to acknowledge their relationship. The knowledge that every advantage Charles gained came at the expense of her biological daughter created conflicts that she never fully resolved. The Pemberton plantation itself became a symbol of the broader contradictions and injustices of the antebellum South. After Colonel Pemberton's death in 1845, the property was sold to pay debts and legal settlements. The mansion stood empty for several years before being converted into a boarding house for merchant sailors, its grand rooms echoing with the voices of men who had no knowledge of the secrets that had once filled those spaces. The broader implications of the Pemberton case extended far beyond one family's tragedy. Legal scholars who studied the case noted how easily racial identity could be manipulated in a society that based fundamental rights on arbitrary physical characteristics. The switched children had demonstrated that the entire foundation of American racial classification was artificial, maintained only through social agreement and legal enforcement rather than any natural or scientific basis. Judge Thornbury, who had overseen the legal resolution, wrote extensively about the case in his later years, using it to argue for broader reforms in inheritance law and racial classification. He observed that the Pemberton scandal had revealed fundamental flaws in American legal and social systems that would eventually require more comprehensive solutions than individual court cases could provide. The story of the deadly pact also became part of Charleston's folklore, though the details were often distorted or romanticized in the retelling. Some versions portrayed the Countess as a tragic figure destroyed by circumstances beyond her control, while others depicted Charles as a vengeful child who had destroyed his own family out of spite. The complexity and moral ambiguity of the actual events were gradually simplified into cleaner narratives that better served the purposes of those who told them. But the most haunting aspect of the Pemberton case was how it illustrated the arbitrary cruelty of systems that classified children based on ancestry rather than individual merit or circumstances. Both Charles and Marie had suffered profound psychological damage from learning that their entire identities had been constructed through deception, and neither ever fully recovered from the knowledge that their lives had been built on lies maintained by adults who claimed to love them. The Countess, in her final letter before departing for France, perhaps captured the true tragedy of their situation best. We sought to protect our children from the cruelties of the world, but in doing so, we subjected them to cruelties far worse than anything society might have imposed. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions, and our intentions were very good indeed. The mansion on East Bay Street was demolished in 1923, the same year a mysterious fire destroyed many of the courthouse records related to the Pemberton case. Local historians suspected that surviving family members had arranged for the destruction of documentation that might have embarrassed their descendants, but no evidence was ever found to support these theories. Today, only a small historical marker indicates where the Pemberton mansion once stood, noting that it was the site of significant legal proceedings related to questions of identity and inheritance in the antebellum period. The marker makes no mention of switched children, racial deception, or the deadly pact that destroyed an American dynasty, leaving visitors to wonder what secrets might still be buried beneath Charleston's carefully maintained facades. This mystery shows us how the sins of one generation can echo through decades, destroying innocent lives and corrupting the very institutions meant to protect justice and truth. What do you think of this story? Do you believe such elaborate deceptions were common in the antebellum South, or was the Pemberton case truly exceptional in its scope and consequences? Leave your comment below with your theories about how many similar cases might have remained hidden throughout American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries that reveal the hidden complexities of our past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories that challenge our understanding of identity and justice. See you in the next video, where we will explore another forgotten scandal that rocked American society.